Good morning, y'all. It's good to be back with you. I want to start by wishing a happy Father's Day to all our dads out there. Fathers are certainly something special, and I tell you, I did not fully appreciate my own father until I became a parent. And once you become a parent, it certainly gives a whole new meaning to all the things that your parents did for you and still continue to do for me. And I personally am very grateful for my own father and appreciate him more every day and every year. And so my parents have been watching this Bible class, so happy Father's Day to my dad. I recorded this early, and I'm actually with my parents this weekend. So I hope that some of you get to spend time with your dads today and take advantage of the opportunity to wish them a happy Father's Day. Well, as we continue our time together in our study together in the book of Genesis, this morning we arrive at Genesis chapter 28. When we ended last week, Jacob was on the run. He had just stolen the blessing from his father Isaac out of the hands of his brother Esau. And he was now fearful for his life, so his mother was preparing to send him away for his safety, literally having him flee for his life so that his brother Esau did not kill him out of rage and anger. And so as we come to chapter 28, with Jacob on the run after the despicable things he has done, it seems a little strange that the bulk of chapter 28 is going to focus on God speaking to and encountering Jacob. But of course, that's the good news of the story. That when God appears to Jacob, it reminds us that God is a God who meets us where we are. Jacob was far from in a great spiritual relationship with God as we come to the beginning of chapter 28. And even at the end of chapter 28, it's unclear whether Jacob's spiritual status is much better off than it was before. But this encounter reminds us of the God that we serve and how he meets us where we are at. He encounters us where we are and calls us from there. He does not expect us to be perfect to follow him, but he finds us, he meets us, and he leads us from there. And that's what he's going to do with Jacob. So if you've got your Bibles, go and open to Genesis chapter 28 as we dive into the story of Jacob and his encounters at Bethel. Well, as chapter 28 opens, Rebekah develops a plan to send Jacob to Laban. And it starts there at the end of chapter 27. There in verse 43, she tells Jacob, "Arise, flee to Laban, my brother, in Haran, and stay with him a while until your brother's fury turns away, until your brother's anger turns away from you, and he forgets what you have done to him. Then I will bring you back here, for why should I be bereft of you both in one day?" Rebekah here is clearly concerned about saving both of her sons, because what she knows is that if Esau kills Jacob, she's going to lose one son to death, and Esau will certainly be banished and exiled for having murdered his brother. She would lose both of her boys in one fell swoop. So she tells Jacob, the son whom she loves the most, to go flee, to go spend some time with her brother Laban. Meanwhile, she develops a plan for how to do this. And it comes back to a source of tension that already existed between Isaac and Rebekah and their son Esau. At the end of chapter 26, we found out that Esau had married 2 Hittite women. That he had married 2 women who were not followers of God, who lived in the land of Canaan there. And this had apparently greatly displeased Isaac and Rebekah, that their son had been so blatant in his opposition to their desires for him to marry a faithful wife. And so Rebekah comes up with a plan. So she goes to Isaac and she says, we cannot let this happen to Jacob too. So let's send him back to my brothers, to my family, to find a suitable wife for him. And so Isaac says, no, you are right. So he calls Jacob in. He says, you need to go to the house of Bethuel, your mother's father, and take as your wife from there one of the daughters of Laban, your mother's brother. And God will bless you, and he will make you fruitful and multiply you, that you may become a company of people. He asks that God will give to him the blessing of Abraham, his grandfather, to you and to your offspring, that you may take possession of the land of your sojournings that God gave to Abraham. Isaac says, no, Rebekah, you are right. We must ensure that Jacob continues our line, that he is faithful to the promise of God, that he follows God so that God will be his God. And so Isaac goes along and sends Jacob away. Now, that again stirs up problems between Jacob and Esau, and between Esau and his parents. Esau saw, in verse 6, that Isaac had blessed Jacob and sent him away to take a wife from the land of his father, or from his grandfather, and that as he blessed him, he directed him, you must not take a wife from the Canaanite women. Esau began to realize just how much this had upset his parents, that he had taken wives from among the Canaanites. And so he said, all right, I'm going to fix this. So in verse 9, Esau went to Ishmael, his uncle, Ishmael, his father's brother, and took as his wife, besides the wives he had, Mahalath, the daughter of Ishmael, Abraham's son. The problem is, taking a third wife, even among Ishmael's daughter, doesn't fix the problem. It doesn't make anything right. It doesn't change the fact that he's already married these other two Canaanite women. Things aren't getting much better. Esau finally begins to realize the problem, but he doesn't fix it. He tries to just do something else to make it right. But that doesn't solve the problem. It doesn't fix the heart of the matter. Well, with that, we see that Jacob is now on his way. He's left Beersheba and he's gone toward Haran. And as he's traveling, this was a long journey to Laban, about 500 miles. But about 60 miles into the journey, some 2 to 3 days journey, almost 60 miles into the journey, a couple of days journey at this point, he came to a certain place. And he stayed the night there because the sun was beginning to set. This wasn't necessarily a planned stop, but he's just traveling and it's starting to get dark. And so a few days into his journey, and so he stops at this place. Nothing significant about the place seemingly, nothing special about it. But Jacob stops there and he takes a rock as a pillow. And he laid down in that place to sleep. You have to imagine that by this point, Jacob is under extreme duress. He is on the run and in search of a wife. Either one of those things would be stressful in and of its own right. But he was in the midst of some very high anxiety. And on this journey, in the midst of a very stressful and uncertain time in his life, God that night appears to Jacob. Verse 12 tells us that as he dreamed, behold, there was a ladder or a stairway set up on the earth, and the top of it reached to heaven, and behold, the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. And behold, the Lord stood above it. Jacob sees this vision. This stairway, this ladder with the angels who were going back and forth, who were returning from the missions that God had sent them on. And in this moment, God speaks directly to Jacob. This was the very first time that God spoke to Jacob. There was no indication that God would speak now. There was no indication when Jacob laid his head down that night after a long day of traveling, when he put his head on that rock and went to sleep. There was no indication that God was going to appear to him that night. But isn't that the same for us? Sometimes when we most powerfully and clearly feel God's presence around us, sometimes when we feel God speaking to us, they're those moments we least expect it. Those moments when we're often the most stressed, the most burdened. The world around us is crashing. Feels like God's far away. But it's often in those moments that God speaks to us. Now, certainly God doesn't appear to us quite the same way he did to Jacob. But God still speaks, and he still acts. Maybe before you've been sitting in the pew, and the words of a certain song just kind of hit you that day in a way that they haven't hit you before. Maybe they really fit to what is going on in your life. And in that moment, you felt God speaking to you. Maybe you've heard a passage of Scripture before where God was really speaking to you. Something that Mike said from the pulpit just really tugged at your heart that day as a message that God was sending that you needed to hear. We've all had those moments in our lives. We aren't necessarily expecting them, but perhaps that's exactly why they happen when they do. Well, that's what happened here for Jacob. But as God began to speak, God reaffirms the covenant with Jacob. He says, I am the Lord, the God of Abraham, your father, and the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie I will give to you and your offspring, and your offspring shall be like the dust of the earth, and you shall spread abroad to the west and to the east and to the north and to the south, and in you and your offspring shall all the families of the earth be blessed. Oh, this is that age-old promise. That promise that harkens back to Genesis 12. Through you, all the nations of the earth will be blessed. Here we have it for the third generation. God showing his faithfulness to his promise in continuing the covenant with Jacob. But notice verse 15 here. He says, behold, I am with you and will keep you wherever you go and will bring you back to this land. For I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised. This is a new part of the equation. God says, I am with you and I will keep you. Jacob was in the midst of a journey to a land far away. You have to imagine that the stress of leaving his family was high, even if he wasn't concerned about his brother killing him. Perhaps it was because he was feeling particularly homesick that God chose this reminder. We don't know that. I don't want us to read too much into the text here, beyond what we can. But it certainly seems that God knew Jacob needed this reminder, that Jacob needed this assurance, that Jacob needed this blessing in this moment. In this we see that, like it had with Abraham and Isaac, God's promise meant God's provision. That God would indeed provide the way that he always had, that was the nature of the promise. That when God promises to be with him, he's saying, I will provide for you every step of the way. Now, Jacob is going to struggle to live by this more than his father Isaac and his grandfather Abraham had. Jacob's going to have far more struggles on this journey than Abraham and Isaac, but he's eventually going to get there. Nevertheless, when Jacob awoke, he knew that the Lord was in this place, that God was there and he did not know it. This had seemed like an ordinary place, but he discovered that God was indeed there, that God was indeed with him wherever he was. And he was afraid. He said, "How awesome is this place? This is none other than the house of God, and this is the gate of heaven." And so that morning, Jacob took the stone that he had put under his head and he set it up for a pillar, and he poured oil on top of it, and he called the name of the place Bethel, meaning the house of God. We've talked time and time again in our study of Genesis about the significance of a name. And here again, Jacob renames this place. And by renaming this place, he takes this ordinary city that was formerly known as Luz. And he says, no, this place now belongs to God, because God is here. This place, this city, I shall call the house of God, because God is here and he spoke to me. Well, from there, Jacob made a vow. And he says, "If God will be with me and will keep me in this way that I go, and will give me bread to eat and clothing to wear, so that I come again to my father's house in peace, then the Lord shall be my God, and this stone which I have set up for a pillar shall be God's house, and all of that you shall give me I will give a full tenth to you." But notice here, Jacob is still not on this journey fully. He starts wheeling and dealing with God. We know about this, don't we? He says, "If, God, you will do these things you've promised me." He says, if you actually mean it, if you actually are going to be with me and get me back to my father's house at the end of it and give me bread along the way, then you shall be my God. Saying, all right, God, I've heard the stories from my father, and I know the things that my grandfather did and that you did for him, and I know what you've done for my dad. But if you want me to be your follower, if you want to be my God, then you need to do this for me. And if you do it, then God, I will be there. I will give you a tenth of all that I have. I will come back to this place. Jacob here is wheeling and dealing with God. We've all been there, haven't we? God, if you'll just give me this, then I will never ask you for anything again. God, if you will just do this for me, then I will be more faithful. I'll never miss church again. I'll be there every time the doors are open. God, just please do this for me. We start wheeling and dealing with God rather than living lives of faith, of assurance and conviction, as we talked about on Wednesday night a few weeks ago. That look and trust in the promise of God, knowing that his promise means his provision. There was no reason for Isaac to wheel and deal here. There was no reason for him to make this conditional promise. God had said, I will be with you. And I will take care of you until the whole way, wherever you are, I will be with you, Jacob. But Jacob still felt the need to question that God would be faithful. He still felt doubt. At this point in our story, God was clearly not yet Jacob's God. He was still the God of his father Isaac. Jacob's still moving along this path. But nevertheless, God had appeared to Jacob. He had spoken to Jacob, and he had reaffirmed that covenant promise to Abraham and his generations. And with that, chapter 28 comes to a close. This chapter, I think, reminds us of some lessons that we need to be reminded of. The first of those is that God graciously reveals himself to us. While God may not appear to us in a vision or speak to us directly the way he did Jacob, God is still active. He's still revealing himself to us. He's still showing himself to us. He's still speaking to us. He's speaking to us through this right here. He's speaking to us through his word, and we do not want to downplay that. but He's also given His Spirit to us to dwell within us. Oftentimes we see God, we feel God, and we hear God speaking to us through others. We encounter God in the silence of a cool morning as the sun is rising. We encounter God at the rainbow that appears after the storm. We encounter God in one another. We hear God speaking through songs, sermons, maybe Bible class lessons like this one. And we're reminded that God graciously still reveals Himself to us. That He still reminds us that He is with us. That He meets us where we are. With all of our failures, with all of our baggage. And He invites us to trust Him. He promises to be with us everywhere we go. To provide for us and to be our God. And He asks us, will you be my people? That's the gracious God that we serve. And may we always be thankful that He meets us where we are. That He reveals Himself to us. That He still cares enough to speak to us. That He still promises to be with us. But we also need to be reminded that the faithfulness of God is such that we don't need to wheel and deal. We don't need to be like Jacob. Jacob's vow was conditional. It was conditional upon God holding up His end of the bargain. And we know that God always holds up His end of the bargain. But oftentimes the reason we feel the need to ask those types of God, if you just do this, I'll never ask anything again, is because we're aware of what we're asking. We feel that God isn't providing. Perhaps that God hasn't provided. We lose sight of the ways that God has blessed us in the past. But God has not forgotten us. We are, as children of God, as Christians, we are heirs to the promise of God. We are heirs to the promise of Abraham. And God's promises He is faithful to. And when God promises, God provides. Let's not make those if-then statements with God. Let's not try to wheel and deal and scheme our way into God doing things. But rather, let us be people who trust God, who live by faith, not by sight, who know, who can be assured and convicted that God is acting, that God is faithful. You see, Genesis 28, while a rather short chapter at just 22 verses, I think often reminds us of some times we ourselves have experienced. Needing to be reminded that God is there. Perhaps you've had those moments in your life where you've really felt God. If any of you have ever been fortunate enough to spend time at church camp, or maybe it's our family retreat or other things like that, those types of experiences can often be mountaintop experiences for us, where we find ourselves going up on the mountain and encountering God. We can feel God. We can hear God. And we are convinced and convicted of the need to live for God. But then what happens? Camp's over. Family retreat's over. We go back into our everyday life. We come down from that mountain. And when we're back to living in the valley, we forget the mountaintop experience. We begin to lose sight of the promises of God. But let's not let those moments go to waste. Let's not let those occasions where we have been reminded of the power of the God that we serve quickly fade from our memory. Rather, let's use those moments. Let's hear God speaking to us. Let's feel God working in our lives and keep those things in our hearts. Treasure them as reminders for when we are living in the valley, when we are in the midst of our low points, where we are stressed and feeling like the world is crumbling around us. Let's use those moments and those memories to be reminded that God is with us wherever we are. Not just on the mountaintop, but also in the valley. That God will be with us. And that when God promises to be with us, He's also saying, I will provide for you along the way. I am here, and I'm not going anywhere. What a great God and Father we serve. That He cares for us. That He has promised to be there for us. That He leads us. That He provides for us. And that He lets us know He is there in those moments where we most need it. May we never forget that is the type of God that we serve.